Welcome and thank you for joining us in the second of our webinar series on privacy in the 21st century. I'm your host, John Lawrence from Downer Defence Systems. The purpose of this webinar, titled Australia, Why Do We Need a Cybersecurity Strategy?, is to explore the implications of cybersecurity and what this means for government, industry and as individuals. Downer is helping customers protect their information, communications and information technology, operational technology and facilities from threats. Downer Defence Systems integrated cyber security approach ensures coordination of security activities across all business functions. This includes an end-to-end holistic approach with a focus on priorities including people, processes, technology, data and facilities. Please note that participants can send questions for the panel throughout this webinar using the chat function, which will be moderated to ensure that the comments are respectful. So with me today are four panellists. In alphabetical order, we've got Alistair McGibbon, Chief Strategy Officer. Alistair was recently the National Cybersecurity Advisor, Head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, Australian Signals Directorate and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on cybersecurity. He has a private sector and government background and has served as the government's e-Safety Commissioner as the General Manager of Security for Dimension Data. Alistair helped establish the Australian Federal Police's High-Tech Crime Centre during his long stint with the Australian Federal Police, and also previously worked at eBay as its Senior Director of Trust, Safety and Customer Support, and as the local CEO of InfoSec Certification Not-for-Profit Crest Australia. CyberX has a workforce of over 500 of Australia's most talented cybersecurity professionals and a national footprint of over 20 offices across Australia. Jane Holton, AO PSM. Jane Holton is a former Secretary of the Australian Department of Finance with extensive experience in finance, insurance, information technology, risk management, human resources, health and ageing, sport and public policy. Jane is currently chair and member of numerous boards and committees, including the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission. Jane has an honorary degree by the Faculty of Medicine at University of New South Wales, an Order of Australia in 2015 and Public Service Medal in 2002. Also with us is Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses. Lyria is the Director of the Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation and a Professor of Law at University of New South Wales. Her research explores issues around the relationships between technology and law, including the types of legal issues that arise as technology changes, how these issues are addressed in Australia and other jurisdictions, and the problems of treating technology as an object of regulation. Lyria is a member of the editorial boards for Law in Context, Technology and Regulation, and Law, Technology and Humans. And last but not least, Edmund Leong is the Security Practice Lead at Downer Defence Systems, which supports our government and critical infrastructure clients, offering secure citizen services, including sovereign national security, transportation and utilities. A passionate advocate for business-driven technology outcomes, Ed listens and engages with these organisations to help them with risk proportionate cybersecurity to enable their businesses to be more successful. Wow, that's a lot. That's a very impressive profile. So thank you all for joining us today. So to get things started, I'll begin with you, Jane, if that's okay, with a question here. As a former departmental secretary, now board member of a top 100 publicly listed company, is business doing enough to protect critical systems and infrastructure from cyber threats? And what effect will the proposed regulation have on business, especially small to medium enterprises, given the private sector owns the majority of Australia's digital infrastructure?
So it's a really good question. And I think the thing we need to understand in this environment is, and I'm sure we do, that the threat level obviously just continues to escalate. And I think actually the government's strategy is timely and very welcome, because what it does, I think, is remind those of us who are connected to large corporates that this is an ongoing issue requiring constant vigilance and increasing our posture in relation to not just bad actors, but basically the backyard and the backroom hacker all the way through to sophisticated states. But I think importantly, for small to medium-sized businesses, but also actually for mums and dads and kids and everybody who actually has a device that connects to the internet, that these are real threats. And so I think for small and medium-sized enterprise, and a number of the parts of this strategy obviously will be voluntary, but it's a very active reminder that you don't want your business your reputation and probably your finances compromised through some sort of a cyber incident. So this is of course an updated strategy that we're seeing here, and that updated strategy, I think, rightly covers the waterfront in terms of what it will take to make sure that everything from our critical infrastructure through to our sole traders and our mums and dads who operate small businesses, that they firstly have it drawn to their attention that this is a real risk, and secondly, it provides mechanisms and places you can go for advice. So it's really a significant issue, but I do think this is the right step.
Thank you. Yes, and there's quite a lot of press about the cost to society. I think there's one article here which Australians lost $634 million in 2019 alone, and the national economy, the total cost is something like $29 billion a year. So certainly a big issue. And Alistair, given the economic and security benefits of building a sovereign cybersecurity capability, how can Australia develop a world-class cybersecurity workforce? And what role can government play in fostering this development, and how important is education?
Well, there's a big difference between 2020 and 2016, when the first national cybersecurity strategy was launched by Malcolm Turnbull. If we look at 2016, it talked about the opportunity of cybersecurity as much as it did about cyber threat. And it included what I'd call sort of incubation type money that went into various things. So it funded AustCyber, which is part of the growth network part of government, and it funded the cyber CRC sort of in that year or more following the launch of that strategy. If we tick to 2020, we see a lot more venture capital and a lot more private equity in Australia's cybersecurity market, which shows quite a significant maturation in a short time. So ours is a private equity-backed company, for example. There are many now venture-backed cybersecurity solutions companies. I was on the phone to 3 of them just this morning. That would have been unheard of even a couple of years ago. So the market is more mature. When we talk about education, there's no doubt that universities play a role. UNSW, both in its Kensington campus and at ADFA, play a significant part of helping that education space, and so do several other universities. I would say that on the whole, the assessment is, in terms of the cybersecurity market, as an organisation at CyberCX, we're up to nearly 600 professionals in cybersecurity. And as I look across the road here at the Cybersecurity Centre that I used to run, we were 400 to 500 people. It was always tough to find people. It is still tough to find people. And the assessments say there's anything from, you can find a stat to prove anything, 5,000, 20,000 people that we're down in the market. Whatever it is, what it means is it's tough to find people. And I'm not sure that we have yet met what is required, therefore, in churning people out. Whether it's the military that takes a person off the street and trains them in a particular area, they were always a good source of a certain type of people. Whether it's the Signals Directorate that churns out another type of person, whether it's the private sector actually training their own staff, which has not been something they've done, I think, to the detriment of the industry. The need for more micro-credentialing and the more polytechnic and sort of trade type training. So we've certainly seen the TAFEs step up significantly. There's, for the first time ever, a national agreed certificate for type course. But I would say on the whole, we've been deficient as a country. So while the market has actually matured, as I said, in terms of capital, we've yet to see a proper matching of training to needs by organisations. But I might end it there, John, in just the interest of moving on to your next question. Yeah,
look, thank you for that, Alistair. And I think there's some good things I'd like to come back to. And I personally think there's a huge opportunity for us as a country to, upskill people in these high-paying sort of technical jobs. But as you say, it doesn't matter whether it's 5,000 or 25,000. There's still a lot of demand. So
one thing I would say, when I was e-safety commissioner, I used to go to a lot of schools and talk to parents and kids. And I used to say to parents, if you want your kid to go into a white collar, reasonably safe, well-paid job where you're guaranteed work for life, get them into cybersecurity.
Yes.
And I'd still say that to any parent out there or any person looking to retread themselves and get in there. It's not too late for anyone, Jane, to reskill in some of those spots as well. I'll talk to you later.
You got a potential candidate for the Box Hill Institute called Certificate 4. Welcome, Lyria. Professor Lyria Benamoses, can laws and regulations help develop a robust and flexible cybersecurity culture and mindset at an individual and organisational level? And also, what do you see as the legal and or ethical challenges confronting Australia in the 21st century with respect to cybersecurity, given rapid technological changes?
Some very big questions there, so I might give an overview answer now and we can come back to some of the detail in later questions. So laws can change the incentives both for individuals and organisations. A really good example outside the cyber context, but one very familiar to Australians, is car safety. You know, cars have to come with seatbelts, people not wearing seatbelts are punished, and it's not just laws, it's also systems. So most cars now come with annoying beeps that drive you crazy until you buckle your seatbelt. So we can think about, you know, cyber safety with similar kinds of incentives. If you're thinking about organisations, cybersecurity is ultimately a cost. So how can laws provide incentives to encourage organisations to increase the money they spend on getting good cybersecurity? So part of it's already there. We have data breach notification laws that drives awareness of when there has been breaches, creating a negative market impact for breach that then incentivises companies that have a good reason for avoiding a breach because they don't want to have to go through that. One can go further if one wants. You can think about mandatory compliance with particular measures, which is not very flexible, and I'll come back to the flexibility point in a minute. Mandatory compliance with government directions, and we see some of that in the context of critical infrastructure laws. We've seen in the cybersecurity policy the idea of a voluntary code of practice in the context of Internet of Things, but we can also think about what laws or what kinds of legal frameworks can we put around a voluntary code of practice to encourage compliance with it. So you might think, for example, of setting consumer standards around fitness for purpose so that compliance might be then deemed fitness for purpose along this particular axis, for example. So you can think about how to incentivise compliance with even a voluntary code. You can think about things like, well, what happens when breaches occur? Is there a private right of action for breach, a fixed statutory payment that might need to be made to everyone affected by a breach, or directors' duties so that they're personally liable for harm caused in certain circumstances where they haven't, you know, taken charge of cybersecurity. Now, all of these kinds of things may or may not be good policy specifically, and that's why I said we can come back to the sort of specifics of it. But the point, I suppose, I'm trying to make is that you can do various things that might incentivise cybersecurity, albeit each of those potentially coming with other kinds of costs that need to be weighed up, because cybersecurity might not be the only government policy objective when it's setting these kinds of policies. An example of that might be we could have really high cybersecurity if we created a massive government internet filter with whitelists, and the government checked the security of every internet site that Australians are allowed to access, and you would have this sort of tiny internet with sort of minimal access, but it would be very safe. I think most Australians would say that's not worth the trade-off. So not everything that helps is necessarily a good policy. The other point very quickly is it's not just about incentives for organisations. You can think about incentives that will help individuals as well. We've already had some discussion about training, but we can make things much easier for consumers as well as looking at sort of broad education. So for example, in the context of the cybersecurity strategy, the government has a series of questions consumers might ask before buying a device to connect to the internet. Things like, can you change the password? Are there regular software updates and so forth? And that's quite a hard mechanism, sort of consumers going into their local electronics store, asking someone that might be a relatively junior member of staff a series of security questions that they might not know the answer to or might get wrong. Can we think about ways to make that kind of decision-making easier for consumers? Can we use labelling in the same way that we do labelling for food to have clearer signals that help consumers understand when they're looking at two products why they might prefer one for security reasons over another, using something that's a bit more visual and easy and on the packaging that doesn't involve complex conversations with store staff. Can we think about systems? Can we think about, for example, that the installation instructions on some of these things will make you change the password as part of the installation process, rather than it being a complicated thing that only some consumers even think of doing. So there's all sorts of things we can do, and we can create laws around to help encourage organisations and individuals to do better or create better cybersecurity decisions. You also asked about flexibility, and I've gone on for too long, so I'll try to be quick on this. Some kinds of legal systems are more flexible than others. So if you say, you know, everyone must do X, that's not very flexible. Cybersecurity changes all the time, and X may no longer be the best response to the threat. So you've got to think as well about designing laws that avoid that kind of obsolescence problem. And you can do that in different ways. You can make things outcome focused. So there's very high penalties when there's a breach, for example, so everyone's trying to avoid the same outcome rather than having to tick a bunch of boxes that may or may not be the best way of achieving that outcome. You can use principles-based regulation, which makes it harder to monitor compliance, but provides more flexibility for how organisations work within those principles. You can create rules that are easier to update. So industry standards, for example, rather than embedding rules directly in legislation that's harder to fix. So you've also got to think not just about what should the legal framework be to create the right incentives, but how do we design it so that it's well adapted over time and encourages good practices over time, and not just what we might think might be a good idea today.
I think that's a very good point, because, and as Jane touched on earlier, these risks are only growing, potentially exponentially, as well as the opportunities. So I mean, we should come back to that obsolescence problem and the maybe the concept around principles and that, because I think there's a lot there. Ed, so your question is, the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, has faced intense scrutiny in recent years regarding the perceived trade-off between privacy and security. So there's quite a few quotes on this, and there's that famous case about the FBI trying to access the iPhone to solve a murder. The quote that I have here from Tim Cook is, quote, "We at Apple reject the idea that our customers should have to make trade-offs between privacy and security. We can, and we must provide both in equal measure. We believe that people have a fundamental right to privacy," unquote. Do you agree with this? And if so, what does this mean for us as individuals and for these government regulations?
Thanks, John. Firstly, welcome. Afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here amongst distinguished panelists. Look, I'll get to whether I agree with this or not right at the end of my response. And I think it's interesting to consider this dilemma between privacy and security, and the reality, I think, isn't working as well as we'd like. It's been hard to legislate away this problem. And for example, Australia's access and assistance law from 2018, sometimes referred to as encryption buster laws, were met with quite fierce resistance when it was introduced. However, since then, through a number of amendments, as recently as last month, it's been largely watered down. Legislation, the legislative mechanism never really envisaged a physical compartment or a storage area that couldn't be entered without any legal oversight. And applying the digital equivalent of this paradigm, I think will always be problematic, because by definition, cryptography, necessary for security and privacy, by definition creates a space that makes it computationally infeasible for third parties to enter. And it's also impractical to criminalize strong encryption as well. People will always find a way to meet their privacy and security needs. And to your to set the context behind Tim Cook's comments, yes, you're quite right, John. That was during the time of the San Bernardino terrorist mass shooting back in 2015, where Apple resisted these court orders to unlock seized phones of these perpetrators. In that case, the US government eventually dropped their action when they managed to get a third party to to get into those phones. But the context of those sentiments, I think, was started back in 2013, where, if you will recall, that there was a notable turning point between the relation between US government and big tech with Edward Snowden's disclosure of the NSA's long-running mass surveillance mass surveillance program known as PRISM. And it really turned the public opinions against Big Brother. So if we look at choosing between privacy and security, I think we should look deeper for more nuanced understanding to uncover that they're actually not quite different. And I'll tell you how. If we consider both governments and individuals having a similar goal of preventing unauthorized people from having access to data they care about protecting. So if I drill into that, preventing unauthorized, that's privacy. Having access to, that's security. So if I refer to an article by security journalist Daniel Miestefat from 2018, the word that we use in our industry, security, actually comes from two Latin words, si, which is without, and cura, worry. Without worry. And I think without worry is the most succinct description of the goal that our industry has, that I've ever heard, and it applies equally to both privacy and security. It allows us to reduce the discussion to basically first principles. For example, there are consumers, businesses, and governments. They all have data that we care about, and they want to control how it's collected, used, and protected. So despite the opposing technology and divergent values, they all share the same goal, which is protecting our data. We want a worry-free digital experience without feeling that Big Brother's watching, and without the feel our data is being used against us during a compromise. Both privacy and security are important in our connected world, and as a consumer, we should have both. But has anybody asked how much of each? And that's why I think we should look at it alternatively as a spectrum or a continuum, with privacy on one end and security on the other. I think in reality, it will always be a trade-off. It will always depend on letting consumers make some simple informed decisions on what protection is necessary at the cost of privacy, and potentially what privacy is necessary at the cost of protection. So back to Tim's comments, yes, I agree that you should have privacy and security in equal measure. I do, but that only represents the midpoint of this continuum and ignores all the other points that allows us, consumers, businesses, and governments to participate in this digital economy without worry.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. That's a good answer. And I think you've sort of touched on a key point here, which is around risk. And I too see it as a trade-off. I think even the Singapore government's had their data hacked, and I don't think anything's totally secure. And I think someone earlier mentioned or touched on this. It reminds me of the Tylenol scare years ago, and someone was questioning or challenging one of the executives from the pharma company as to why they couldn't stop people from accessing these things who have ill intent. And they said, well, you can't. If you make it, you can't stop people accessing it, because that defeats the purpose of selling the product. So that's when they introduced the tamper evidence sort of concept. So I guess in terms of risk and thinking about that, Jane, there's a question here from Ronald, which is about to increase citizen awareness and privacy in cybersecurity. It helps to have stricter privacy legislation and putting accountability for data protection with those who store, process and access our PII, which I had to Google, which is the personally identifiable information. It goes on, making CEOs accountable and liable to proper information management, even when outsourced. Often companies think that identification and authentication mean making copies of IDs. What are you seeing here? Because you've got the wonderful position of sort of being in government and leading government organisations. You're now working for top 100 companies. What? Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. So before we do that, Annabelle asked a question about where the $29 billion number came from. If you look at page 10, Annabelle, of the cybersecurity policy, that's where you'll find that $29 billion figure. I just had the time to look it up. That's a question. Anyway, that's the answer. So look, and I think the some of the answers we've already had go to how it is you're going to balance up here the risk and reward equation. I think it's been quite nicely drawn out, where the extremes of this situation are. You can be completely safe and access absolutely nothing, which is not in anyone's interest, or you can have the Rafferty's rules kind of world where anything goes, and none of us are going to be happy with that. And I do think personally identifying information, I don't personally think that we have had the full extent of the discussion about that yet. I think people don't fully understand identity theft, what's going on the dark web, etc., and why it is you should be very careful about some of those things. Now, the more we have incidents around these matters, the more I think individuals will worry about this. But certainly when it comes to the big corporates, there is quite a high level of awareness, actually, and the whole issue around breaches. So if you look at some of the highly regulated industries, there are now reporting standards under those regulatory arrangements, and I'm thinking here in a banking context particularly. If you have any sort of a privacy breach, you are required to report under 234, which is the relevant item in that standard. So I think what we're seeing here is a level of escalation around what it does take to actually get people in the private sector to pay attention to this. Now, I can tell you from a banking perspective that there is very, very, very clear understanding that the notion of actually disclosing people's personal information is something which, from a reputation perspective, let alone whether or not people would have recourse, is really, really important. So whilst there is a legislative, a regulatory regime that requires things to be reported, and that's got a pretty low threshold in terms of what actually needs to be reported in, the thing I can tell you from a governance perspective is that, at a board level, and I chair the Digital Business and Transformation Committee at ANZ, at a board level, the work that's been doing in my committee is something that we then take to the whole board, and that there is such a level of concern about these matters, and that we have a very level of high level of hygiene in relation to those issues, recognising, and again we've heard this already, that there are ever-changing challenges, which is why the more outcomes or principle-based approach I think is good. So I don't see at the moment a situation where you would need to get the mallet out to crack the nut, in terms of particularly from the big corporates, them understanding that this is something which is fundamental to the trust that people place in them when they do their business with them. But I would absolutely agree that this is the sort of thing that needs to be kept under constant review. I think actually the bigger challenge for many will be in that smaller to medium-sized business where this has just not been something that has occurred to people. And even the fact that you're storing, for example, people's identifying details, name, age, date of birth, specifically place of birth may even be something that's relevant. Those are the sorts of data points that people who do want to create false identities, those actually have a value to others, and therefore you actually do have a duty of care and a responsibility to play that quite carefully. Now, I think the thing about the strategy is that it should encourage, and of course we have to think about what the communication mechanisms are here so people become aware of it. So it should encourage people to start thinking about those things. In some sectors they already do, thinking particularly here in relation to healthcare, where I think people have a very high level of understanding of the importance of keeping private information private. But I think we would all acknowledge that there are other bits of the economy where as yet that understanding hasn't penetrated. And Alistair talked about some of the work that they're doing in terms of increasing awareness. A company that I'm associated with is Vault Systems, where again it's a cloud, but it's a sovereign-based cloud, and we're seeing increasing numbers of people approaching us in relation to the need to ensure that information that they hold is actually held securely, and it's held securely domestically, as opposed to being stored in India, where we know that our laws don't reach. And we've seen even some quite sophisticated government players get caught by breaches that occur offshore, which they then do not have any legislative recourse or reach into those jurisdictions. So my the short answer, sorry, I've gone on too long. The short answer to the question is I don't see at the moment the need to significantly up the legislative framework in respect of penalties, because I think my preference always is to start with a sort of regime that has regulatory elements to it, reporting elements to it, and then the education and improved approaches to compliance. Now, ultimately, you can go there if you need to, but my preference would be to go there on the basis of evidence of need.
Thank you, Jane. And Alistair, look, this sort of touches on a comment or you made at the start, which I took as quite encouraging. I actually joined AVCAL many years ago because I have this view that as Australians we can do whatever we set our minds to, but we tend not to be able to commercialise a lot of our good ideas, which I think is a lost opportunity. But you're saying there's been a big shift since 2016 to 2020. Is this shift occurring at all levels with the SMEs and as well? And we're also, as we speak, I mean, you know, we ain't seen nothing yet as far as I'm concerned with technology. We've already got AI, ML and quantum computers. I think University of New South Wales, in fact, have a quantum computer that I was reading about, say, a year ago. So all of this goes back to Lyria's point about having a principles-based approach. But yeah, what could be the catalyst for sort of promoting that, you know, that cyber awareness, I suppose, within the SME sector and also the skills?
So just so thanks for reaching out to me. I was going to actually jump in on the back of Jane's comments. So Jane sits on the board of a big bank, and there's no doubt the banks, in my view, have, you know, and I've been in this space quite a while. The banks have always been at the forefront of this. I would say that they're at the forefront of the confidentiality part of cybersecurity, and cybersecurity is confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems and data. One of the things I would say, on the whole, if you were going to give Australia a mark, and you'd probably give the same mark for pretty much every country, if it was a report card, you'd probably give us a C- or a D for how we went with protecting personal data. That's not the banks, by the way. That's just as an economy. So the same data might reside in the bank as it resides in some easier target, and that target gets knocked over. You know, my identity is my identity. It's gone and can be misused. So, you know, we've not done well for confidentiality. My biggest fear is we haven't done very much at all about integrity of information, which brings us to that AI, Internet of Things world, real-time decisioning without a human in the loop type stuff, which does worry me. And then availability worries me an awful lot, particularly as we talk about critical infrastructure. So it's a roundabout way of saying, look, there's no doubt that this economy has been divided into those who have cared and invested and those who haven't. And unfortunately, the list of those who have cared and have invested is very, very small. And I've been talking to those boards on both sides of that for years. I do think there are more and more moving over. I mean, just general sort of Corporations Act duties of directors and officers, where more and more risk is pushed onto them, has meant that they've started to take cybersecurity risk more seriously. And again, so the bigger end of town, it's spreading down that list more, are starting to understand at least what the risks are. Mitigations and detecting them and remediating them is another thing, but you've got to at least have an awareness to start. So I think from that top end, it's going well. You know, just after the government launched the 2020 cybersecurity strategy, it put a discussion paper out on critical infrastructure. It was a week later. And it talked about raising the number of industries caught up in and designated as critical infrastructure from 5 to 12. So it goes from electricity and water and gas and ports and telecommunications, 4 of which are caught under the SOCI Act and 1 under the Telecommunications Sector Security Reform, which is a Telecommunications Act amendment. So those 5 into 12 sectors, which will grab those 5 and push them into things like banking and finance will be in there for the first time. Transportation, which will bring obviously land transport, air, and the ports are already captured. Energy, which captures the gas and electricity and other such things. Why am I saying all this? Because it's again a maturation in understanding the bits of the economy that connect with each other, that make up this critical mass of critical infrastructure, where integrity and availability are just as important, if not more so, frankly, than the confidentiality side. I do think, if you know, for those, you know, Jane's already mentioned page 10 of the strategy. I'll direct people to paragraph 36. Which talks, in general terms, I'd call it a market signal from the government to say that it's increasingly minded to look at changing things like Privacy Act, the Consumer Law, data laws, and I think more importantly in the second dot point, a very oblique reference to the Corporations Act to increase obligations for owners and of systems of national, or no, not just of national significance, of any type of computer system that provides a service. And that will drive more obligations upon directors and officers, probably already caught under the Corporations Act, but I think to specifically call it out, like CPS 234 does for the financial sector, run by APRA, is an important signal to the market to raise its game. Long answer to a very simple question. Short answer is, in a supply chain world, and in cybersecurity, everything is linked to everything. So I can have my house in order, theoretically, not that you ever can have it completely in order, but if all of my supply chain, who tend to be smaller and weaker and not as understanding, can be attacked or degraded or have stuff stolen from them, then my defences are completely worthless. So unlike a lot of other parts of security and national security, in cybersecurity, there can be no person left behind. And we haven't yet grasped how to do that. I do think the market signal to the much larger part of that Corporations Act is a good way to start getting there. You've got to crab walk your way into this anyway. You can't suddenly go from being sort of an anarchic, self-governed place, you know, Rafferty's rules, as Jane referred to it, to a suddenly pristine, well-governed, you know, cybersecurity being on everyone's lips world, which may not be the world we want to live in anyway. But where's that natural place for us to sit as an economy, accepting the fact that there's always going to be risk with these connected technologies? But, you know, small businesses, households, really tough to defend yourself against a nation state when we see those same nation states being able to knock over well-defended, or at least reasonably well-defended systems. You know, no one can really protect themselves against a determined offender. Anyway, that's a stream of consciousness, which means I'm just going to go on mute.
Thank you, Alistair. And I think that's a very good point about the nation state. I mean, how can the, you know, the local hairdresser or you know, fast food outlet defend itself against a sovereign? It's just but as you say, that, you know, there are ways in, and there are some things that I've read about too, which sort of I find quite startling. But I'd like to come to you in a second, Ed, and we can sort of start at the risk of being too controversial. There's a question here about foreign digital interference, but before we get to that, Lyria, there's a question from Lola, and I'll quote this. I think hopefully you can see it, but whose responsibility is it to educate us all about the dark web? Should this be a personal responsibility, and should companies be addressing this more seriously, given how tech-savvy our kids are? Does education start as early as school level? I guess this goes to the whole education and the remit and mindsets and upskilling the new generation.
Okay, I'll have a little go at that, but there might be others on the panel who can say a lot more. I think we've got to think about education, if you like, in different phases or different, you know, timings. I don't think it's true to say that because kids are tech savvy, they're necessarily cybersecurity savvy. I think there's a big difference between those two things. There are programs at schools at the moment that are helping, you know, with cyber education and cybersecurity and getting kids to think about not telling people their passwords and so forth. So that is starting to happen, but it's not sort of automatic just because they're on their iPads all the time, right? Like it has to actually be done. And you can look at that through the school system, absolutely, and then take that forward. At the moment, we've also had conversations about, you know, people who are going to become the cyber professionals and how you educate them. But I kind of want to think about even tertiary education or TAFE education in a different way too. So what do people who are not going to be cyber professionals, but are going to be professionals who will have control over data or have to think about that, what do they learn about cybersecurity? So to give an example from my own field, what do we want every lawyer to know about protecting their clients' data? Because I think cybersecurity is particularly important given the sensitivity of data that lawyers hold. So how do they, what sort of education do we need to make sure they have? And I could make the same point for sort of people who are going to become health administrators or go into a whole variety of other fields, because you want that to go beyond, just basic high school education, but it's not necessarily being built into university programs outside of these sort of disciplinary boundaries, right? So you don't take typically a cybersecurity course in a law school. You have to already be in an engineering or computer science school and so forth. So how do we think about that kind of education being much broader, even in that kind of context? But in terms of the sort of educating everyone idea, I think that's to the extent we can do it with really simple things like what makes for a good password or keeping your software up to date, I think that's great. But I do think we need to think about the rest of the legal system to help make it easier for consumers. So as I said, things like labeling are mechanisms that consumers can use with education to help them work out, which product to buy, for example. So it's more complicated than just a sort of basic education campaign. The different pieces, if you like, have to fit together and have to work out that everyone has the education they need for the role they're playing, whether that's just the role everyone plays as being on the system or the very particular risks associated with particular industries.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, on a related point, there's a HBR article that I was reading, and it talks about phishing, but and boosting your resistance to phishing attacks, and talking about type 1 and type 2 thinking. But in this context, the quote is, if you teach employees to protect their information at home, they'll take those lessons back to the office and apply them to company information, unquote. So I guess that just sort of highlights the importance of that partnership between industry, government and individuals. So Ed, should a cybersecurity strategy, this is a question from Peter, and then there's another question here from Sharia Akhtar, which we'll come back to. Should a cybersecurity strategy include protecting general elections from foreign digital interference? And you might want to jump in here too, Alistair, given your past experience.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yes, it does, and I think it has. If you consider Alistair's remarks a bit earlier, that if we look at the apparatus or the systems that we use to conduct our general elections, if we consider that as critical infrastructure, because it serves a very important function in protecting the cornerstone of our liberal democratic society, which is trust, trust in the process and trust in our political process system. So by classifying that and adopting some of the, the mechanisms in the critical infrastructure discussion paper, for example, if you classify it as a regulated entity or a system of national significance, an example, there are additional controls that would afford a level of protection to this apparatus. And I think it's important for agencies, for example, like the Australian Electoral Commission, to have a look at their end-to-end posture of the componentry and set the apparatus that they use to conduct these elections, and conduct an assessment on how much risk they are willing to tolerate to interference and interference on the integrity and the availability of the data used to produce the result.
Yes, and sorry, Alistair.
I think the most important piece of critical infrastructure we have in Australia is our parliaments. I mean, people on the seminar may not agree. We might disagree politically and how politicians behave, but the most important thing Australia has is its democracy. Everything else stems from it. If you're a public servant, the people you answer to are the political class, and they're the ones that then set the laws that we all operate under. And so we need to look at electoral systems as critical infrastructure. Interestingly, of course, if we think about how cyber can influence those elections, we go back to the late 2016 during the US the last US presidential elections, where we see Russia actively involved in stirring dissent in the US. Now, many would argue you don't need a foreign government to help do that, but in 2016 it certainly did, and the Russians have not denied their involvement in this. And that was a wake-up call for democracies all around the world, that other nations will manipulate information, use micro-targeting. Remember, you don't have to influence everyone in a country, you just might need to influence a handful of people and a handful of electorates to change the outcome of a vote, which to me is potentially catastrophic. Now, is that a cybersecurity question? Is it a question for how information flows? It's really tough if you were in my last role to sit there working inside an intelligence agency to be saying, here, we're going to protect democracy. Most Australians would think that's a bit of an anathema. So is it the police? Is it the electoral commissioner who then starts commenting on what's right and wrong in terms of messaging? And has it already had an effect? You know, by the time you take that message down, and how do you stop it being propagated through systems? You know, the social media companies have been particularly poor over the years. They've only just now been dragged into having some responsibility of understanding the role they play, right through to cybersecurity, real hardcore cybersecurity issues of, can I trust the vote counting, or can I trust how the outcome of the vote counting is being portrayed to the public? They might be very true cybersecurity issues right out to the softer edges. But to me, cybersecurity and elections should go hand in glove. And we're going to need to ask ourselves some really tough questions on who has that responsibility and authority in a liberal Western democracy. But I tell you what, the worst outcome is not having that discussion and actually biting the bullet on it. The worst outcome is another nation determining the outcome of our elections. I've always said that's Australians' job to screw up that thing, not some other countries.
Agreed. And Lyria, just before you jump in there, yeah, it is an interesting point, Alistair. And there's another question here from William, which I always, which resonates with me. And we're sort of going off topic a little bit because it's sort of like the economic and the social and sort of from the private to the government. But William's question is, what cyber capability should Australia be developing in the context of a cyber war? And we could argue that we've been in, there's been a cyber war going since 2010 with Stuxnet, arguably. And it's interesting too, the US and how they do that forward stance. I'm trying to think of the terminology, but they've got a very clear view on how all this should be dealt with. Hunt forward, that was the terminology. But going back to the elections, Lyria.
Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points about security in elections. The first one is just the software that we're already using in elections, particularly for things like vote counting. Most jurisdictions in Australia use proprietary software. Researchers have already demonstrated bugs in the software that's being used, but can't do proper testing because they can't get access to the source code. So I think we really need to think quite deeply, and agreeing with Alistair here, about how we want that to work and how we can ensure that the software being used in the electoral process is secure. But I also wanted to come back to the point about how voters get manipulated. And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the link between privacy and security. The way that people get manipulated is often because of information about them, you know, whether it's psychological information or where they live and what electorate they're in. But it's the fact that other actors have access to that kind of information that helps them target messaging in ways that ultimately manipulates voters, and often in non-public ways that others can then access and critique. So I think that I kind of wanted to link that back to not just a security issue about how we manage that, but going back to the question of how we deal with our privacy laws in particular to restrict to make it harder, I suppose, for malicious actors to get information about Australian voters in order to use that to manipulate us. Because we do, sorry.
All the social media companies, Cambridge Analytica, of course, you know, freely used information from Facebook, which we freely gave, which included information that was surreptitiously gathered, aggregated, sold to third parties, potentially nation states as well, to use against the very economies that grew Facebook in the first place. And it shows that total lack of responsibility that the large tech players have had over the years, to the detriment of the very economies that spawned them.
Which is where I disagree, I suppose, with the point that Jane made earlier about consequences for bad practices and not complying with things like privacy laws. I certainly think that when we're looking at the behaviour of companies like Facebook in light of what came out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that we need to have sufficiently high penalties to incentivise them not to act in ways or not to be careless as to how their data is being used and who has access to it.
Well, let's be clear. I don't want my position misrepresented, which I think it just was actually. What I said was, don't take a hammer to crack a nut. So if you actually understand that behaviour is not as it should be and does not meet a community standard, by all means, go the regulatory approach. The point I was making is that if you impose a very tough set of penalties without good reason, I don't think that that encourages the right kind of behaviour. So I don't want my position misrepresented, because I think you just did. But I think it's really important that we have appropriate penalties in a context where harms are quite significant. And to the Cambridge Analytica point, the Cambridge Analytica point is a really important point, because that was actually legal. And it goes to the naivety of some of the people who actually thought that if we just share everything, life will be wonderful. And so they did not understand why this was an issue. And even now, I would argue some of them do not understand that. Now, that's a different thing, because we can actually start to have a view about what the harms are that come from this. And if people will not take appropriate steps, and this is my point about what's going on in the banking context, I mean, there are obligations on reporting, and there can be an ever-increasing array of penalties if they are needed. But providing actually people recognise harms and take appropriate steps, I don't think you take the hammer to crack the nut. But if people aren't doing the right thing, different matter entirely, particularly when there's significant harms to individuals.
And if I could, sorry.
I just wanted to say I hadn't meant to misrepresent your point, Jen, and apologies if I did that. That was not intentional. But I agree with what you just said. I think that, you know, there's no reason to have penalties that aren't needed. I suppose my point is simply that in the context of the behaviour of organisations like Facebook, we need two things. We need to have penalties for breach that are significant enough to incentivise good behaviour. And we also need to look at the actual laws themselves. So I agree with you that not everything that is happening is currently a breach of the law, because we rely on things like consent, for example. And then people are asked to read, you know, way too many privacy policies. I think someone even put in a privacy policy once for a joke that you agreed to hand over your firstborn child, and everyone just clicked, I agree. Obviously not reading the policy first. So the point is that we have private, we not only need to think about the penalties, we need to realign the rules to ensure that they are not, it's not simply a question of, well, as long as someone ticks an I agree box, it's essentially virtually a free-for-all.
And I think that's a really important point, because, and I think that the ACCC did something on this. They made the point rightly that you bombard people with pages and pages and pages of stuff. Nobody ever looks at it. Now, that is not actually getting effective consent here. The fact you tick something which on any reasonable analysis you couldn't have been expected to understand, I think is a fair enough issue. So, I mean, this is very complicated, and we really are here talking about cybersecurity. And of course, what we've done is we've gone into privacy and we've gone into critical infrastructure. And that's, I think it's a good demonstration of the point that was being drawn out at the beginning of this, that all of this stuff is related, and you need a regulatory framework, you need a level of community understanding, you need a level of business engagement, and you need to constantly upskill all of those things if you're going to actually respond to what are escalating threats.
Yeah, and to me, listening to all this, and again, I've been in trouble for using analogies too much, but it's a bit like the shift in behaviours and attitudes to drink driving back in the day. I mean, there was the overt introduction of penalties in terms of drink driving laws and RBTs and everything, but I still remember very clearly as a kid having those advertisements with the young father in the jail cell and head in his hand, sort of, you know, getting across the message that actually drink driving isn't a machismo thing. Actually, so there was a clear case, I think, of targeting the behaviour so that people started to think about something differently. And in terms of the skills and the training, so there's that question there, Alistair, from Sharia. Did you want to respond to that about the was it the federal government, the Internet of Things products education?
So I think the question, let me just read it. Question related to, is there any are there standards for consumers in relation to cybersecurity? Just last week, the federal government released a code for Internet of Things connected devices, which I think is a really good first step. We should think about this in terms of, so look, for years people have argued that we should move to things like an electricity consumption or a water consumption label on the front of a device, like you do if you went to a big box retailer today and you were buying a washing machine, you'd see the number of stars for energy and water consumption. And that has driven a significant amount of consumer behaviour. You'd argue vehicle safety is another classic example, where one of the first questions people ask is what's the, I think it's called the ANCAP rating, you know, is it a 5 or is it a 1? If it's a 5, I'll take my family, and if I think that's good, or is it 1 good? I'm not sure. All I know is I ask what's the safe car, because that's what I want to put my family into. Could we do the same thing with internet connected devices? The short answer is yes, comma, and no at exactly the same time. Because what's secure today, like a vehicle thing where you say, yep, we do crash tests, and the crash tests are the same, you know, forever, and, you know, the technology inside the vehicle isn't going to change. The technology inside this device here changes the second it gets re-flashed by the phone manufacturer. The technology inside this thing that I'm looking at you guys on will upgrade and update. And unfortunately, there's a whole range of really nasty people on the other side who are busy trying to break it all the time. So what is safe today may not be safe tomorrow. In fact, may not be safe today because we just haven't found the vulnerability, unlike a crash test or a water consumption or electricity. But if we go to a principles-based thing where we say, is this device, is it shipped with need to change the password as soon as it comes out of the box? Is the manufacturer committed to updating the software in order to patch for vulnerabilities that become known? Is it, and on it goes, then the answer is yes. Standards and that consumer messaging should help. Because if you had a choice of a device manufacturer said, this is our code of to try to keep you safe and secure, versus one that doesn't, I would consume an item or carry out an activity with a firm that warranted that it had subscribed to that code of conduct. So I think there is a way for us to drive consumer behaviour, but the vast bulk of this, and sorry for the long answer, which is very non-traditional of me for anyone that knows me, I say as sarcastically as possible, is that most of this is going to be driven from the top down to what services get given to consumers via firms. But I do like the bottom-up approach. I just wouldn't necessarily see it as the thing that's going to solve the problem, because the last thing I'd say is this: as someone that spent 20-something years trying to talk to people about safety and security online, it's a tough road to hoe because of the complexity of it. And I often get told, why don't we do a slip, slop, slap campaign when it comes to cyber safety, and or cybersecurity, since they are so intimately linked? And the answer is because it's so much more complex. I know as an aging white Australian that I need to make sure that I wear a hat and sunscreen, don't always do it. And I know the ways that I can reduce the chance of skin cancer, but it's much harder to protect myself or to be more safe online than those things. We can give them some basic tips, and it'd be good if we could start draining the swamp that way, but it's not likely to solve the problem. It's got to be designed out by corporates and governments, I think, is the best and quickest way for us to be protecting the public.
Yeah, and a good response. And question from Michael here for you, Ed. Are there any current or future trends the panel can share in regards to the cybersecurity threat environment impacting both the public and private sectors?
Yeah, so the threat environment has Jane opened with, it's worsening, and it's no surprise because it's also been outlined in the cyber strategy where they talked about the general decline in the conditions with the the entrance and the activities from criminal gangs, nation states. So having this context, I think it's important to note that data is essentially one of the things that these threat actors will always want to exploit. And if you know that the privacy of individuals' PII data is weak, they'll always attack that as the easiest way in, because it's more economical for these threat actors to conduct their operations. So because you're exploiting the vast volumes of data that's available, technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence will also be used in defense as well as offense. What I expect to see in the near future is machine-assisted offense as well as machine-assisted defense, where you essentially use those technologies as a force multiplier. For us, we like to consider that as a force multiplier for defensive purposes, but there's no reason why our adversaries will also use that for offensive purposes. And also an important trend is the relevance of IoT and industrial IoT security as we bring more into the public awareness the security of critical infrastructure. That ranges from, as Alistair said, the 12 topics, traditional industrial energy, mining, gas, utilities, but also other things that are not immediately obvious, such as cloud, electoral systems, and also defense and defense industry. So there's a number of things that are enablers for those patterns and trends, and that's essentially data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and also industrial IoT.
And that's probably a good segue back to you, Jane. So, and potentially you as well, Alistair. I mean, there's a question here. How do you see, from Adrienne, how do you see AI impacting the future of work in cybersecurity? And are there any particular skills you think younger generations who are keen to get into the field should pursue over the coming years? I'd also tack onto that. I mean, the comment I think earlier from Lyria about obsolescence problem, and your comment too around the principles. Maybe we can bring that into the back end of that. But in terms of
look, the question about AI and if you think about what people who wish to disrupt everything that we do will attempt to do, AI is both an enormous advantage potentially, but also potentially an enormous weakness. And so I think the real challenge we're going to have going forward, and if you think about it, we've been talking about sort of the escalating risk and the escalating steps you need to take to make sure that people are protecting themselves and are being forward-leaning on this, as opposed to waiting till there's been a kind of terrible disaster and then saying, oops, we left the door open. But particularly with AI, I mean, the thing about machine learning is it depends on essentially what you ask it to learn. And so if people have the ability to get in and affect things around the way the machine learning actually operates. So if you're thinking at a really macro level, and I'll give you a particular example in relation to machine learning, for example, in the medical space, where, or indeed data analytics, where you use machine learning often to try and derive key lessons or key insights, either, for example, in medicine in terms of diagnostics, and you might be using machine learning to do things like read x-rays or pathology results or things of that ilk. Now, if you can actually get in and tamper with how machine learning actually operates, you've actually got the potential to cause enormous harm. And so we need to understand that whilst the great gift and opportunity of machine learning is the capacity to process things very often at rapid speeds, huge volumes, and to get better at that in time. And we've already talked about elections. where you are looking to process things in rapid speed and at huge volume. Well, the kinds of disruption that comes from interfering with things like AI, I think are very significant. Now, when it comes to what we need by way of skills, I'm always reminded of a good friend of mine who was a lecturer in computer science, who laughingly said to me one day, well, of course, I did my degree in the 50s and there was absolutely nothing I learned, and he was lecturing, and there's absolutely nothing I learned in my degree that is in any way germane at all to what I do today, other than the general principle that standards will continue to improve and you have to continue to stay in front of the game. So I think for young people, the kind of skills that we might ask them to go off and learn, was it the Box Hill Cert 4 that you were recommending before?
Well, that was the first one that got that Cert 4 international and national recognition. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the bottom line is, whatever is your base level of education, you have to do something that is manifestly industry relevant, and you probably have to have a range of skills that are pretty evidently connected to this kind of world, including analytics, etc. But what we know is that you will have to continue to upgrade, because if you want to stay current. And hence the joke that I could go off and do the Box Hill Cert 4, because all of us need to keep our skills really at the cutting edge, because otherwise we're no longer useful practitioners, we're observers of history. And if you're going to stay current in this world, you need genuinely cutting edge practitioners. But I mean, the one other thing I would say about AI, of course, is that it's one thing for AI to either undertake tasks or produce analytics. The thing that we will never necessarily, we could have a discussion about this, about robotics, but whether or not you can ever train AI for judgment, and whether you can train AI for the kind of the policy thoughts and the market, for example, sensitive matters that you might regard as being matters of judgment, we don't yet know that. But certainly in terms of the risk that we run from AI-enabled systems, they are, I would argue, probably magnified than probably some of the other areas.
Yeah, I think I totally agree, and I think there's huge opportunity with AI and ML, and we've talked about this before. I mean, there's even the simple example I use is if someone in your family is sick and you've got a machine that can do some brain surgery and it has 99% efficacy rate versus something that's fully explainable and 70%, you'd probably go the 99%. But if you're denied credit, but even in this context, you might say, Alistair, that with the rate of change and the speed, if we get an election result that's managed through ML or AI or something of that nature, but we can't unpack it, or we can't, it's a black box, then I guess that makes it more prone, more susceptible to foreign interference or just interference generally.
Well, can I just make one little observation about that? The Russians are a bit prone to poisoning people, right? As we know, so sometimes not successfully. But the truth of the matter is that requires you to physically get an agent to somewhere near the intended recipient, and sometimes, unfortunately, getting it to non-intended recipients. Well, imagine if you were using AI-enabled medical software to actually perform some procedure on some high-risk target for another, a non-state actor or a state actor or whatever. Well, you wouldn't even have to get anywhere near your intended victim to provide them with a substance. You would simply be able to manipulate an outcome using that kind of intervention. So I think you start to see that you can not only have a kind of community-wide effect, but you can also be very targeted if you were minded to be that way motivated.
Great. Alistair, did you want to add to that?
Well, apart from not wanting to be a Russian opposition leader at any time soon, or a dissident generally, to Jane's point with Novichok, I agree. But look, you're right. I think and I'll rue the day thinking this or saying it, but I think we often overplay the role AI will play in the near term, and ML. We know most AI is more machine learning. To Jane's point, we sort of say what we want you to learn and we teach those things. And there's no doubt augmented machine capabilities, both in terms of cyber defense, you know, where you can go through a large amount of data looking for anomalous activities or predicting the way something might go, I think is a good thing. There's no doubt offenders will be using that as well to look at how they can move into places. So if you're talking large volumes of stuff, but, you know, I contemplate in a very people-heavy business, which we are. So I think about this, you know, almost daily. The phrase I use to the teams that I work with is, we've got to disrupt our own business before someone else does it for us. Every time I look at any allegedly AI type of solution, I still fall down on the person who's doing a better job. That doesn't mean that you can't have this augmented process, but there's still a human somewhere in the loop making a decision, saying that's right, that's wrong. My judgment call, to Jane's point, is I'm actually going to go this way, even though the machine's suggesting another, because I understand the consequences of these things. Whether we can teach machines consequences, morality, the trolley car dilemma type of questions, then I suspect humans are still reasonably safe. But the last thing I'd say is this: we don't have a great history of wondering about the consequences of our actions in bringing technology into these loops. It's only post-fact that we sit there and think, whoa, was there a better way we could do this? There aren't that many ethicists sitting there saying, don't plug that machine in, because it's actually not a good outcome for humanity. We tend to plug it in and then post-fact say, that wasn't a very smart idea, but by then it's been adopted by so many things that we've lost that human intervention bit. So I'm not a Luddite at all, because I very much enjoy technology, but I do wonder whether or not we understand the consequences sometimes of the path we're taking.
Agreed. And actually, there was a point that was made by Dr. Simon Longstaff on our last cyber webinar. He said we should start with the ethics in mind, otherwise we risk having another Monsanto sort of scenario. I guess putting in another context, so Lyria, is that, you know, I read somewhere that I think Google have driven over 1 million kilometres in Australia with their, you talked about the trolley car there, Alistair, over 1 million kilometres on their autonomous vehicles. So again, there's an opportunity here, as I see it, to have a really thriving, vibrant industry. What seems to be lacking is a sort of a legal framework, and this, I guess, this brings in that question from Roger around how can the security strategy be used to address stimulation and growth of Australia's national cybersecurity research and development, technology, innovation, development, and commercialisation. It's quite a lot.
That's a very big question. I'm not sure I can answer all of it. But maybe just someone who's involved in research, just to flag a few things. First of all, there is already funding. You've mentioned the cybersecurity CRC, and there's other things as well where research in this area is funded through other research schemes and so forth. So it's not starting from zero. It's really thinking, how can we make that research better? One of the significant challenges I find in a university environment generally, but also specifically in the context of cybersecurity, is how do you incentivize interdisciplinary research? Because cybersecurity is ultimately not purely a technical problem. There are technical elements, and you need people to research on encryption and other very technical areas that can be done entirely within one discipline. But you also need to solve the bigger policy problems that require looking at, for example, the role of law and standards, the role of particular technical solutions and so forth, and understanding a problem as a whole, the psychology, the law, the technical stuff, social science and so forth, to really be able to do this effectively. And that's something that I tend to find university structures often work against and funding structures often work against. So I suppose my answer isn't a full answer to the question, but it's just, I suppose, to think more creatively about what we mean by cybersecurity research and how we can bring different expertise together to make that happen more effectively.
And thank you, Lyria. And Ed, so there's a question there from Zoo. So we've got a few minutes left. We should have time for this one. Zoo's asked, many organisations are developing and or implementing a cybersecurity management framework. In your view, what are the most important elements of an effective cybersecurity management framework? And could you please share some examples of successful implementation and or pitfalls?
Yeah, great question. I think effective cybersecurity management, in our experience, starts from the top. You really need to have the board, the CEO, invested in the outcomes and understanding what the risks are if they don't get it right. and legislating against getting it wrong by the proposed changes mooted in para 36 of the cyber strategy, where there are criminal penalties for directors and board members, puts essentially the industry on notice that you need to get this right, just in a similar way that health and safety is something that's not negotiable. And some elements, if we look at the frameworks, ISO 27001, the information security management system is a good starting point for understanding the information security as a system, both that contains physical security, cyber security, obviously, but personnel security, but also I think it's been called out quite well in the cyber strategy is supply chain. So it looks at the problem in 4 dimensions: personnel, physical, information, and supply chain. Other frameworks we've seen used, especially in my experience in government and industry, is also the COBIT, the Controlled Objectives or Information IT, as the overarching framework for putting cybersecurity or information security in the context of the broader process universe that an organisation should have. Also, the ACSC Essential 8 is also a good controls-based framework that it's reasonably easy and straightforward. Makes it more accessible for organisations to distill the highlight reel of the ACSC ISM. And finally, there's something new on the horizon. In January earlier this year, the US NIST agency, National Institute of Standards and Technology, published the CMMC, the Capability Maturity Framework, for all US government agencies to comply with by 2025. And that's a very useful cyber maturity framework that encompasses the 4 dimensions that I just spoke of. And it's a 5-point maturity scale. And I would anticipate in the next few years, we would see that being advocated and spoken more about in the in our environment in the defence and Australian context.
And there's a whole conversation in that alone. So thank you, Ed. Yeah. Just in the interest of time, I might sort of just wrap it up with any closing comments, sort of going left to right on my screen here. Lyria, did you want to add anything before we call it a wrap?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Alistair, any parting comments?
No, thank you, John. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And Jane?
Well, we might as well make it a consensus now. I think we've had a good run around the paddock. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you all. And look, wow, that's amazing. So on behalf of University of New South Wales and University New South Wales more broadly, and the Downer Group, I'd like to thank all of our speakers very sincerely for sharing their valuable time. I know you're probably going to rush off to board meetings as soon as we hang up. So, and you're obviously out and about there, Jane. So your knowledge and expertise is very, very valuable. And I think I personally feel that this is something that we as Australians can do very well at. If, if, as you say, Alistair, if we can lift our performance from a C-/D to a B or an A, that'd be nice. And this session has also been recorded and will be shared via email with everyone who registered for the event. And we look forward to seeing you all at future University of New South Wales events. Thank you.